All right, so welcome everybody again to our monthly seminar series on cybersecurity for biomedical engineering, put on by the UCSF-Stanford Center of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, joint with the Food and Drug Administration. I'm your moderator, Kevin Fu, where I'm Acting Director of Medical Device Cybersecurity at the FDA. A couple notes before we get started with the seminar today by Professor Stefan. This seminar series does not represent official FDA policy or guidance. The contents are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the official views of, nor an endorsement by, FDA, HHS, or the US government. This seminar is being recorded. A little bit about my background here, but again, I'm the Acting Director of Medical Device Cybersecurity. I'm also an Associate Professor at the University of Michigan, and I'm excited to have our speaker today, Stefan, introducing us to automotive cybersecurity issues. But before we get into that, why are we talking about cybersecurity for biomedical engineering at all? Well, you don't have to go too far in the news to find headlines about problems of vulnerabilities in computers causing outages and other havoc in the medical device manufacturing community and healthcare delivery organizations. And you can also see various governments enacting policies to improve defenses against these computer security problems that can affect the safety and efficacy of medical devices and the delivery of patient care. So this seminar series was created to bring in experts from cybersecurity, which is what we call it in the government, but in academia, it's often called security and privacy. But we're bringing in experts from the academic world of security and privacy to introduce concepts to the biomedical engineering community to help those in medical product development better understand what methods and tools and lessons they can learn from the other disciplines. So today, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Stefan. He is from Computer Science and Engineering at UC San Diego, so thank you for waking up a little earlier today. He's going to be speaking about modern automotive vulnerabilities, the science behind the fast and the furious. And let me just say a couple things before we get started. I've known Stefan for, I think, 20 or maybe more years, 20 or 30, I can't remember when, quite a long time. He's had a very colorful history with high impact research, everything from infiltrating the illicit drug market online and understanding where all those spam emails come through for sort of fake ED drugs. But he's also been quite active in what we're going to hear about today on things like protecting automobiles and even airplanes and other very kinetic systems from computer security threats. Today, he's going to talk about the automotive world, and I hope the biomedical engineers on the call can start to see some parallels with problems that happened in that market, how they might translate to the medical device world, and where some shared mechanisms for defenses can be helpful. So without any further ado, I'd like to again turn over the stage to Stefan. Thank you again for joining.
Again, thank you for having me. This is going to be one of those lessons learned talks. I'm going to describe kind of the experiences that we have had in the automotive sector over the past decade, that many of them actually do, I think, in many ways have direct analogs based on some of the work that I do now on medical devices in that sector as well. Regardless, I think you will learn a bunch and be entertained along the way. So some 10,000 foot context first. When people talk about computer security and when you look at what are the products and services and effort and research and funding and so forth, most of it is focused on the things that we traditionally think of as computers, servers, laptops, cell phones, perhaps. But in fact, the vast majority of microprocessors in the world are in embedded platforms. They are not in general purpose computers, but they have all the same power as general purpose computers in the sense that they can compute the same general functions, have the same strength, and hence the same kinds of weaknesses. At the same time, in many ways, they are more powerful because quite a few of these embedded systems touch the real world. There are very few objects that you use or participate in that have mechanical components that are today not really computer mediated. Everything from your airplane to the elevator to your telephone. Ultimately, these have long since evolved past their early designs to ones that are very much computer controlled. And this is very much true in the medical device category as well. This is just one subcategory in this space where pretty much everything today is computer mediated. All right, so all of these have this very common pattern and largely a common origin story, that there is an original class of device that we add computing to for some reason of cost, safety, efficiency, scalability, functionality, and so forth. So in automotive computers is due to the California and then the Federal Clean Air Act, where we need a way to modulate the fuel oxygen mixture in response to the amount of nitrous oxide coming out of the tailpipe. And there was no mechanical device that could do that quick enough. So they said, well, we're going to put a computer in there and we're going to have that modulate how the engine is functioning. And then, it's one of these things. Once you see the power that you can get from a computing device, you start adding it for anti-lock brakes and stability control and all these other things, as well as entertainment functions and environmental controls. There's lots of things you can do with computation that you simply can't do mechanically. Then the next inevitable addition is we add communications to the system. And this is typically to improve control or management or integration. So like in pretty much all big buildings, the elevators are computer controlled, but then the control is exported over IP networks so that they can centralize and sometimes even outsource elevator control out of the building. And that's very convenient from a management standpoint. It also helps with integration with other services. You can go and have a schedule for when people are getting off work. And again, this isn't unique to elevators. It happens in every single sector. It happened in cars. It's absolutely happened in medical devices. And this combination of computation and communication creates very much the situation where we have cybersecurity risk, because we both have a mechanism to access the input for this device, and then it is a general purpose computer. And so all of the ways in which you can interact with it potentially allow any vulnerabilities or problems that it has to be touched. So today I'm going to talk about this in the context of automobiles. I like doing this in the context of this fairly bombastic setting, which is the Hollywood Fast and the Furious franchise, because they recently had a movie, the 8th of the series, in which the core, the core element of the bad guy's attack is taking over all these cars and in fact using them as the weapon. And I first want to just kind of run you through, for those of you who are not diehard Fast and Furious aficionados, I want to run you through kind of what that actually looks like in the movie. So I'm going to show you a little clip. All right. So we're going to start here with the enemy named Cypher, who is they're going after at some convoy, like the Russian ambassador has the codes to nuclear weapons or something, and they're going to try to take them out. So let's see. Let's get started here.
Hack them all.
All right. And so here she's commanding her people to remotely, by a satellite, starts with this single car, go and take over its system, and then it's going to start to drive away. All right. And then this gets multiplied across a series of systems. So now you find a bunch of cars being taken over. And this is shown in the movie as all of these cars being taken over one at a time. And this ultimately gets put together into these swarms of cars that are then brought together as some kind of weapon to attack this entity. Culminating in this, and then the ultimate part of this was not enough, is the attack from the sky, where they take over cars in a parking structure on command and have them drive out the windows and fall synchronized on top of this motorcade so as to stop the Russian ambassador and hence recover the codes. I did tell you it was bombastic. All right. So with that context, whoops. Today, I'd like to couch our story in terms of talking about how much of this is feasible. So can someone's car even be remotely accessed over the network? Can someone take control of their brakes and engine and so forth in the manner in which we saw? And if so, why? Why would that be possible? And how might this relate to other market sectors and other kinds of networked computational devices? And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about, let's assume that some of these things were true. Why don't we actually see any of this kind of stuff in practice, which is the other side of cybersecurity, which is not just the technical capability, but the things that make attacks happen. So I'm going to try to touch on all of those. All right, so first, the high bit is, yes, remotely taking over cars is a real thing. And it's been a real thing for a decade. I'm going to show you a little clip from a demo that we did on 60 Minutes. In this particular demonstration, Leslie Stahl, who's the host that night, has been put, there's an unmodified, it's covered up, but this was a Chevy Impala, unmodified Chevy Impala that Leslie is driving. And while she's driving, we're going to turn off her brakes.
All right, there we go.
Oh, no, 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 no.
The brakes
I
didn't
cannot,
work,
oh
right?
my God. I can't operate the brakes at all. Oh my word. That is frightening. That is frightening.
All right, now that, but actually the funny part about that story is that we had some trouble getting her brakes turned back on. It eventually did work, but here's some of the reason why that was possible. So I know nothing about cars. I grew up in Manhattan. I'm gonna level with you. And so we got into this. My mental conception of a car was very much kind of the Henry Ford Model T. It's a mechanical thing. There's some explosions. It drives some pistons. And that's actually very far removed from what a car looks like today. A car is pervasively computer controlled, from the brakes to the transmission to the engine, pretty much every piece of functionality. And in modern cars, even aspects of the steering have some amount of computer control in them, and is internally networked. And so, what happened early on is they started adding more cars. Dragging wires between all these pairs of computers didn't make sense. So they set up an internal network for all these cars to communicate. But then it's also externally networked as well. And some of these are things that you would recognize as an external network, telematic services like Onstar, or if your car has Wi-Fi, you might recognize that, oh yeah, my car's talking to the internet. There's other parts that you might not think of as being networked, like the fact that you can do hands-free calling on your Bluetooth, but also like your keyless entry, or the fact that your radio tells you what station you're on. So somehow that works, or your tire pressure. All of these, there are all of these external digital inputs that are typically wireless that come in as well. And so to a first approximation, the car has ceased becoming a primarily mechanical device and has become a complicated distributed system. It is probably the most complex distributed system that you personally own, that happens to have wheels on it, because that's its function, is locomotion. But in fact, the complicated innards of the car are no longer, but the electronic part. All right. So in fact, in a modern car, you have somewhere between 20 and 40 different what are called electronic control units. That's the automotive parlance for computer. They're super heterogeneous. So it varies from little microcontrollers that might cost a dime all the way up to 3 gigahertz processors with multi-gigabytes of memory that you might find in your phone or a laptop. There are literally dozens of different operating systems and runtimes, and from year to year, the software and hardware can completely change, and that's because of the supply chain model that the automotive industry has, which is that the individual components of the car are provided by suppliers, so-called tier 1 suppliers, who in turn get pieces of the equipment as well as the software from tier 2 suppliers, and so on and so forth. It's all internally networked using a variety of different standards, with CAN bus historically being the dominant one. And then it's externally networked as well. And there's a variety of ways in which that takes place, and I'll discuss each of those. All right, so I think the first bit of evidence that we provided in this space, or the first thing we explored, was this question of whether once someone had access to this network, if somehow they were inside the car, and we approximated this using, there's a network interface that is mandated by federal regulation called the Onboard Diagnostics 2-port. All of you, if you're curious, you can look under, it's almost always under the driver's side dash, and it'll look like this little doohickey on the screen there. And it's basically, it is the Ethernet port for your car. And so we asked the question, if we access this port, can we compromise the security of the vehicle? And the answer was yes, that we could do all kinds of things. We could turn off the brakes, we could manipulate the engine, we could do all that kind of stuff. And we did this in 2010 Chevy Impala. This was in no way unique to GM or to the Chevy. And in fact, over time, there are others who, in 2014, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek demonstrate the exact same thing with a 2010 Toyota Prius and with a Ford Escape, and others have shown it in other domains. So one question is why? Why is it that simply accessing the network is sufficient to basically make all of the security of the vehicle crumble? And part of it is it's very much not designed to resist that. So this is a completely open network. It has what we would call a software bus style architecture. So every component gets to publish their results to every other component. Everything is broadcast. There is no authentication between components. In fact, there's not even identification. So the messages indicate who the recipient is to be, but don't say who sent them. So you can't even distinguish between different senders. All of these different components have this innate coupling that is part of the functionality. And some of this is very unintuitive, because an immediate question you might have is like, well, can't we separate like the really safety critical stuff like the brakes and the engine from things that are not safety critical, like the door locks? And the answer is you can't, because there end up being all of these mission requirements that cause there to be a linkage between them. So one simple example is when there is a crash, there are sensors that will cause the airbag to deploy. And then it's supposed to turn the engine off, because you don't want the engine to keep running after the crash because there's risk of fire. And after the engine is off, you want to unlock the doors. You don't want them to be unlocked before, because there's a risk of the door opening during impact and people flying out. And so that kind of recipe of things that are designed to be done in the case of a crash that are for safety reasons require there to be some computer that creates a path between the engine and the crash detection and the doors. And so that means that there is some path between them. And this repeats again and again. There are literally hundreds of these implicit couplings. At any rate, one kind of result here is that all of these invocations between ECUs can simply be recorded and then replayed. And that's, in fact, a lot of what we did in the beginning. The other issue they have is that this same network that's used for communication is also used for maintenance. And in the maintenance context, you have to allow the car to be put in unsafe states. In the same sense, in a medical device, you may have to be in diagnostic mode, you may have to be able to put an ICD into various therapeutic states, even if that wouldn't be the right thing for all patients. In the automotive context, there's extremely weak authorization. So the thing that puts you in the maintenance state is not terribly well protected. And it would almost be impossible to be very well protected. Finally, the same network is used for software update. And so if you have access to this network, you can update all of the software in the system. And so in the limit, you can just rewrite all of the code. So I'll give you a really simple example. The kind of replay attacks are fairly obvious. We record things and replay them. This one's a little bit more interesting. So all cars expose private diagnostic interfaces to service personnel. testers in the lingua franca of GM. And that allows manipulating the internal state on these devices to put them in unsafe modes. For example, bleed all the brake pressure so you can work on the brakes. I don't know. Yeah, there are two challenges for attackers in doing this. One is there's some access control on entering this diagnostic mode, and the other is that it's completely undocumented what the commands would be in this diagnostic mode. There's no manual out there that says what's supposed to happen. So first, to speak to the access control protocol, here's one. This is a typical access control protocol, at least circa 2010, where the tester, and this is the device that your mechanic will plug into this port in your car when you take it in for service. It will make a request for this seed, and your unit will read that from memory and send it back at 16 bits. The tester, to prove that they are a real tester, will then take that number, run it through this algorithm, the secret algorithm, to produce a key, which they'll send back. And the ECU also has a copy of what this seed with the algorithm applied to it should look like, and it can check to see if they did the right thing. So there's a ton of problems with this. One of them is that it's 16 bits. You could brute force this in a short period of time. But kind of more important is that the algorithm is the secret, right? And so the secret is not that secret because it's shared among all of the cars that you've sold. And so as a result, it becomes very difficult to keep this. And every single mechanic has to be in possession of it. So it turns out that there's this whole community of people who like to, tune their cars to basically make them faster or have more horsepower at the expense of violating EPA guidelines as well as their warranty, who have figured out most of these things. And these were not carefully managed. So in some cases, there was the same value seed response across all the cars. You didn't even need to know the secret algorithm. You just record the value. In some cases, you can just read them out of memory. In some cases, they don't even check. And this was, again, not unique to GM. This has been true across the entire industry. So then the other issue was that I mentioned that this is completely undocumented. And as I mentioned early on, I and actually none of my colleagues at the University of Washington at UCSD knew anything about cars. And so the approach is a technique called fuzzing, where you just generate these quasi-random test strings and observe the effects. And what that translates to here is they put the cars up on jack stands, they took out a notebook, and they started sending messages. And they say, well, when I send this message, blue smoke comes out of the engine. When I send this message, this happens. And over time, you try to, without even understanding why, you get to see that there is this cause and effect. And this, in fact, unlocks quite a bit of functionality, including the turning on and off the engine and the brakes and so forth. Now, there's an argument that this is not surprising. We had physical access to the vehicle. You could have snipped the brake lines and so forth. And so this is a contemporary news account that complained that this was too much was being made of this. And they said, look, that the only risk that they talked about that was engaging was this theoretical one about remotely hacking via the telematic system. But this is vastly too hard, and I can't see anyone bothering. And the fact of the matter is that we had done this at the time. There was just no ethical way to report it because we didn't know how to fix it yet. So it turns out, after we got together with GM and their cellular provider and were able to add mitigations, we were able to document that this is true and show that, in fact, we could take over, in fact, all of their GM OnStar Generation 8 cars, which was several million cars at the time, without any physical access at all at arbitrary distance. And again, not unique to GM. This gets demonstrated by Miller and Valasek 4 years later for the Jeep Cherokee, and then in 2020 against the Tesla by Keen Security Lab. I think it's part and parcel for how these kinds of things are built, and represents kind of an industry-wide kind of vulnerability issue. So one way to think about this, or the way that in the computer security community we tend to think about these kinds of issues, is in terms of what we call the attack surface. How would an attacker reach the vulnerable item? And so we explored three different kinds of vectors via which an attacker might reach the automobile. One we called the indirect physical vector, whereby the attacker does not have physical access themselves, but has some way to compromise something else that will itself have physical access. So those shop tools that I talked about before that your mechanic plugs in, if you could compromise those, which in fact we showed we could, and one of the students even built a thing that could go into any dealership and take over all of the tools in that dealership. Or the CD player. I'll talk about that one a little bit more. So the ones in bold here are ones that we actually did. Another vector is short range wireless. This is wireless that has a fairly limited proximity. So Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, keyless entry, the tire pressure sensors and so forth. And then long range wireless, things that are, long distance, tens, hundreds or thousands of miles from cellular, HD radio, satellite radio, and so forth. So I'm going to talk about just a couple of these to give you a sense of the breadth. I don't have time to go through all of them, but it'll give you, I think, some sense of the range of problems that come into play. So for example, the car that we were dealing with had a built-in CD player. That's back when people still had CDs. And, a CD is just a bunch of ones and zeros. The thing that turns it into music is actually as a computer. There's a little microprocessor in your CD player that is parsing these ones and zeros and figuring out what waveform they correspond to and dealing with decompression and all of that. That is a computer. If it is compromised like any other computer, there you go. And so the input to that computer actually is the song. And that media player is also connected to one of the car's CAN networks. And as I said before, having gotten into one of those CAN networks, you can spread to the other ones. So experimentally, we demonstrated actually 2 attacks with these CDs. One, and this was actually, I think, somewhat interesting, was it turns out in reverse engineering the code for this CD player, there was a specially formatted CD that you could put in that when you put it in would cause it to rewrite all of the code on the CD player. And GM was absolutely unaware that this feature existed. This was a surprise to them. And the reason it was there is because the supplier of the radio, who sold to the OEM market, also sold to the aftermarket. So, you can buy a car and then buy an aftermarket radio and plug it in under a different brand name. When you sell to the OEM market, you can rely on using the internal buses to update the software. When you have an aftermarket radio, that won't work because it's not integrated with the car. And so the companies needed to figure out a way, well, how do we update our software for our aftermarket radios? And so they came up with this magic CD feature. But they used the same source code for both the OEM market and the aftermarket. And why? Because that's much cheaper. Software reuse is dramatically cheaper, and no one told them not to. And in fact, if they had told them not to, they would have said, okay, but you need to pay us money to manage that difference. And in fact, this notion that there is more functionality at some interface boundary between code written by one entity and another happens again and again, is responsible for about 90% of the vulnerabilities that we have. It's rarely as simple as, oh, there's a bug. It's frequently one vendor is making use of another vendor's service and doesn't take into account how much more functionality is available in that service than they use. All right, the other one we did was a straight ahead bug in the parser. And what was cute about this is that the bug was very unique to the context of this player. So we could take any song, it'll play fine on your laptop or what have you. But if you take this encoding of a song, put it on a CD, and someone inserts it in their car, it'll take over that car. The other one I wanted to talk about, because it was kind of the bigger deal and the closest to this kind of Fast and Furious thing, was the Onstar component. And it had 3G digital cellular, but it provided access via the cellular voice channel. And the reason was cellular voice still had better coverage than data. And since the principal market, the first marketing advantage for Onstar was automated crash notification, coverage was far more important than having a high bandwidth connection. And so as a result, GM and actually almost every car manufacturer at the time made use of a software modem made by Airbiquity. so that you would take your signal, it would get encoded into a call that into audio signal that would be sent over a cellular connection to Onstar master control. And there were a couple different issues here. And one of the key ones is very similar to this thing I said before, that the vendor who wrote the code for the telematics unit, which was LG, had some assumptions about the size of the messages that could ever be sent, because they were the only ones who would ever do it. Ubiquiti was a much more general piece of software that could accept much larger messages. And if you could, in fact, cause something to be sent that was larger, it would happily process that, but the underlying code that LG had was never designed to handle that. And then there was an authentication issue that I'll leave there. But in the end, this whole thing, again, because it was an audio channel, could be encoded entirely into a song. So the mode of taking over the call was you had a song, you called the car. This is actually a picture from the demonstration that we did for the Department of Transportation and GM, where we called our car, played this song out of this MP3 player into this conference telephone, and the car was outside and it starts honking and windshield wipers going off and so forth. All right, so I'm going to give you a little demonstration of this last one in action. This is one of our grad students, and they remotely are going to enable his brakes without his.
Yeah, that works. Oh, is he going to go to the wall?
Is doing. And this is over, again, that telematics channel. And we demonstrated things like this at a distance of, 1,500 miles. So there's really an arbitrary distance component to this. Whoops. And here's one we put together. This is kind of cute. I'll show this. So the premise here was a future kind of theft, because once you take over these cars, you can do it en masse. They all have GPS, you get the location. And so we anticipated a model where you, as a thief, would call up and they would give you the GPS coordinates for a car, and that you would then drive away with. And so in this example, Carl Kosher, who's the grad student who you'll see walking in a second, does not know where the car is. We have just given him the GPS coordinates, and he's going to walk up to this vehicle on the basis of those GPS coordinates. And then remotely, and this is taking place in Seattle, but we're doing the remote unlock from San Diego. And so as he approaches the vehicle, this is in San Diego, we unlock the car, and then we're in the process of turning off the shift lock solenoid, the steering wheel, turning on the engine. You'll notice Carl has no keys. He's going to buckle up. And part of that is pneumatic. It takes us a while to do this other stuff. But then he simply drives away. That car was off. All right. So now one of the interesting...
Stefan, the audio on the video was a little overpowering, so we couldn't hear your narration.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'll just explain really quickly.
Comment again without...
Yeah. The context here is this was to anticipate a consequence of this kind of issue, which is that you could have outsourced automotive theft. So in that demonstration, Carl, who is the graduate student walking up, does not know where the car is. We have informed him of the GPS coordinates, which he has followed to the vehicle. And then when he gets there, he's in Seattle, we're in San Diego. We unlock the car, disable all of the security measures, and start the engine, and he drives away because he has no keys. The only thing he's been given are these GPS coordinates. All right, so one of the big questions is here: why were there so many issues that we found when we started this work? And I think one of the principal ones, and this I think it applies very much in almost all embedded sectors, is that there were no adversaries. So in the absence of adversaries, you don't have the Darwinian pressure on a market to improve its security functionality. The reason our PCs have as much security functionality as they have is because we would not have kept buying PCs in kind of the post-2000 era, given the explosion of attacks, if they hadn't done something. And so software makers in the server, laptop, cell phone market have been forced to adapt in order to survive. Absent that, in these embedded markets where they don't have a lot of adversaries, at least to date, it is very difficult, and we heard this story time and time again at different manufacturers, it is very difficult to get budget to implement security functionality against attacks that have not revealed themselves in practice, because you are very much a cost center there, and you can't argue that in fact it's critical for the sale. And this makes it really tough to put substantial investments in. So that's one. The other is that there were strong forces on feature creation, and those were both market pressure issues. And it's different for every sector, but for automotive, there's a variety of issues. One of them is that younger people aren't buying cars, and so they're trying to make them stickier and add more internet features and so forth. But there's also a regulatory side, which is the Department of Transportation has been pushing them to add more and more sophisticated safety features that require a lot of communication and computation in order to implement. The other issue here, and this is not true of all markets, but they have very tough time to market pressure, and the OEM is not the manufacturer really, but is the integrator. So Toyota, GM, Ford, whoever, with the possible exception of Tesla, they are really assembling components to make the vehicle. They aren't making all those components. And this has a number of knock-on issues. So one is their supply chain is super cost-driven. So if they have a vendor who will offer the same piece of functionality for a few pennies less, that supplier will win. Those cost issues in turn promote broad reuse. So if you are a vendor, if you have some code that roughly does what the OEM is asking for, you're going to reuse that code because that's how you keep your costs down. And so that ends up meaning that you routinely have pieces of code that have functionality that was created for lots of different manufacturers in lots of different settings, all in the same place. There are many vendors, and the coupling is not perfect. In fact, they have very loose coupling because they bring all of these components together late in the manufacturing process. And that means that it's imperfect. It's not designed all to work together. It's kind of shoehorned in to make it work together. Heterogeneity is very high. Again, as I mentioned, there is no standard hardware platform. There is no standard software platform. And then for intellectual property reasons, all of these suppliers are potentially in competition. They're in competition with each other, absolutely. But they're also potentially in competition with the OEM because the OEM takes a certain number of things and does them in-house. And so one of the things that we came to realize that was very surprising was that there is no car manufacturer on this planet that actually has the source code to their car. It does not exist because all of the different components, the supplier holds that source code. The approach to security that requires a holistic review is not feasible in practice because of the way the industry works. And then finally, in 2010, they had no experience with product security. So they didn't even know what to do with these problems that we showed up with. There also are some really interesting, what I would call extra technical constraints. So there are a lot of these problems that are easy to fix in the abstract. Like if you get a bunch of academics and say, hey, we'll go design a car, we could come up with a car that is not vulnerable to these things, but absolutely do not match with how the industry works. Like I said, you don't get to see the source code. You have a cost structure that makes certain things not feasible. Like on those little microcontrollers I was talking about, they can't do digital signatures. They simply don't have the horsepower to do it. They also have requirements that any mechanic has to be allowed to access these diagnostic interfaces and update the car, any mechanic. So you can't say, well, we'll just trust all the mechanics because there are thousands of mechanics that you're constantly having to increase your features and hence your attack surface. That there was no, until very recently, there was no remote update capability. So if you had a problem, you needed to recall all the cars. And then finally, the design window on new electrical designs was about 5 years. So like if you came up with a new idea, you would get in the next 5-year design cycle, but you can't change the way things are right now. It'll take a while for that to work through. All right, so I'm gonna do a really quick story of our disclosure, and then I'll talk about why we don't see so much of this. So in 2010, we had found all that stuff we talked about. We made a choice to not kind of make a big deal in public. We worked very closely with the OEM and with the regulator, which was National Highway and Traffic Safety Information. We never name GM. The only reason I'm naming GM now is that they've outed themselves. We provided no code. And in fact, our papers are rather unusual in that they describe generally the kind of vulnerability, but do not provide enough detail to replicate because we thought it would be irresponsible to do so. It also meant that we weren't in an adversarial relationship with the OEM. And because our goal there was to try to get them to understand that there was a problem, to act in concert, and that if we were in an adversarial mode, that wasn't going to help when they really had very little capacity to deal with the problem. And one of the challenges we had here is that there are traditionally these models about vulnerability disclosure that don't really apply in this context or apply differently, because the consequence of exploiting one of these potentially involved loss of life and limb, as opposed to like losing your Excel spreadsheet. And also there was no way to update. And so a lot of the kind of implicit assumptions in the model of disclosing vulnerabilities to the world which were that it's not that bad and everyone can fix it, didn't apply here. So short term, we worked pretty closely with them in fixing bugs for generation 9 Onstar. The next model year had all the bugs we had fixed out. We rolled out mitigations in the cell carrier. GM, after having 2 board meetings to decide whether or not to sue us, took the right path, and they got security religion. They got really serious. They hired Jeff Massimilla as product CEO. He's now been promoted since, but they now have a whole product cybersecurity team. Lots of changes to their process, to their contracting, to how they do design. Like, they've put a lot of effort into it. However, remember, all of those generation 8 and gen 7 too, actually, devices still had that vulnerability, and there was no recall. And so the question was, are all these things out there still vulnerable? And then there was this amazing story. This is where GM was like, yeah, it was us. GM does an interview with Wired in which they admit that it was GM cars that we had done this work on 5 years earlier. But they do it in the context of saying that they have remotely updated all of the generation 8 OnStar boxes, and any new ones that connect are automatically updated. Now, what is amazing about this is, one, all of this takes place without any discussion with the owners of these vehicles, that it just happens asynchronously, no notice. But then the other part is that generation OnStar, and I will tell you because we've been through that code, has no remote update capability. This is not a function it has. And so Jeff does not spell it out in this interview, but what really happened is that GM went and hacked, 1 to 2 million of its own cars in order to fix these vulnerabilities in them. And I've never seen anything like it. I cannot imagine the lawyers that were involved. All right, and then there's a bunch of direct and indirect impacts that I'll just, we can discuss those if people are interested about cars. But I want to talk, I'm going to move on just in the interest of time. I want to talk about this other issue, which is what makes attacks happen. So I talked about kind of this issue of what we were able to demonstrate and people took seriously enough to fix. One component, which is the one that we looked at, is what is technically feasible. And this is what the security research community tends to focus on. There are a bunch of other questions in real life for real attacks, which is what's economically feasible? What did it cost? Like, it cost us about $1 million to do this, So that first, you're going to need $1 million, and you're going to need it for every make and model that you go after. Maybe you can reduce the cost over time, but is it operationally feasible? Do you have, some kinds of attacks require you to have certain knowledge, or require certain proximity, or require you to prepare the car, or require other things? Then there's this issue of motivation. Why would this attack be happening? Is it economically motivated? Is it out of fame, anger, political interest? And how do those dovetail with these capabilities? Are the people are the people out there in like Anonymous who are upset? Do they really have a spare $1 million to figure out how to hack cars? And then, and this is a big one that people don't tend to talk about, is what is the alternative? So if you are seeking to attack, are there other ways that you might do that with less risk and less cost? And this, I think, is one of the key issues as to why we don't see these kind of bombastic attacks, both in cars as well as other domains, is that there's not real call for them in a way that motivates, that fits the motivations of groups of attackers, or that don't have meaningful alternatives that are less risky. In practice, the primary ways that cars get hacked is self-hacking. So vehicle owners trying to bypass their limits in violation of EPA guidelines or warranty. And there are a ton of markets for this. So there are people who tune cars to go fast, for power, diesel long haul, they tune it for cost so they don't have to pay for new filters, or sometimes for feature upgrading. There's a market for upgrading your Tesla without paying Tesla. And there are lots of issues here about emissions and safety and legality and so forth. And but there are a ton of these. So like, just here's an example, go to Superchips and you can now, retune your RAM thing for more horsepower. I'm going to skip legality. The other one that really happens is theft, and theft is economically motivated. And this makes sense. Again, if you think about this in a Darwinian context, we have made the anti-theft features, particularly immobilizers, so effective that if you're going to steal a car today, you pretty much need to do some amount of car hacking to make this work. And so there's there are a lot of products out there for either jamming the keyless entry system, for grabbing their codes, for replaying them, for bypassing alarms and so forth. And then afterwards, for removing information that would allow it to be tied to the original owner. So I call this getting cars and selling cars. I'm not going to go through what all these different units are, but there's a big market selling these things for car thieves. Some of them have dual use that are legitimate. Some of them, there's no dual use. But that's kind of where the action is. All right. So kind of to sum up, and then I'm happy to do Q&A, is, automobiles, like many complicated embedded systems today, are really, have really become computer systems where the mechanical or external feature is the side effect. All right. So automobiles are big distributed systems with wheels. They have vulnerabilities like all general purpose computing devices do. We don't know how to write software without vulnerabilities. It simply is not a thing we know how to do. We know how to make it less likely, but elimination is not a thing that's in our purview. In this sector, as with many others, the history and architecture and supply chain all conspire, and incentives all conspire to make security a challenge, something that they're working on, and they've gotten much better, but it's it does not happen overnight. And then the other thing I wanted to leave you with was that the reason why we don't see a lot of bombastic things is the primary motivator for attacks these days tends to be economic, although with current geopolitical conflict, we could see non-economically motivated attacks. And so as a result, most of the hacking we see is either people doing it on their own or for theft. But this is a place where one has to track both the change in motivations and business models as well as the change in technology. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Stefan. Well, we already have a question about one of the interesting things that's changed in the last 10 years is electric vehicles, right, and charging stations. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on vulnerabilities specific to these now electric vehicles, especially as they're being charged and connected to these random charging stations around the country.
And I can't speak to it particularly because we only dabbled in that, but I will say that the interface, both on the regular chargers, but particularly on the superchargers, is a two-way interface, and there is this complicated data path that goes both ways, and so I think that's exactly the questioner is right to say, well, that is part of the attack surface, and that is something that someone selling a electric automobile has to be concerned about securing, just like they have to be concerned about securing their telematics or Bluetooth or so forth.
Yeah. Well, also there's in the medical device world, from the FDA side, there's been a lot of activity on what we call threat modeling. In particular, FDA announced a threat modeling playbook that's an educational resource to help manufacturers with that sort of pre-market design, sort of the characterizing the adversary, what's a break, and so on and so forth, and risk. I'm curious if you can comment on what is the equivalent in the automotive world for threat modeling, or what's the state of maturity for threat modeling medical devices in the sort of pre-market manufacturing space?
So I'm sorry, are you asking the question about automotive or about medical?
Automotive, but just in the context of in the medical world, there's great attention threat modeling.
So today, so when we showed up, there was no threat modeling in the automotive world at all. However, there is now the Society of Automotive Engineers, which is the standards body in the automotive sector, has released multiple, they're really what I would call security process standards that have mandated threat modeling for the design of automotive component systems. And they went to I know that they went around and talked to a bunch of people. It's clearly heavily influenced by Microsoft's work on Stride, but I know they've taken input from Sandia and a bunch of other places. They don't mandate a particular methodology, however, and so each OEM ends up taking kind of the general prescriptions on threat modeling and describing the kinds of things one has to do. And I mean, in the standards, they work through the various different kinds of threats one has to consider, and that you have to separate, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and so forth. They don't mandate a particular modeling tool or framework for doing it. And so each OEM ends up adapting their own. I would say, though, that Stride-derived modeling is the most common that I've seen. But it's pretty common now. They have to do it.
Okay, I appreciate that context. A few more questions I'm going to try to sort of bunch together. Leaping off the threat modeling, you mentioned remote access. Medical devices traditionally were not remote access, but imagine a future where many more medical devices have remote access or remote control.
Yeah.
What would be on your mind for threat modeling things when remote control is introduced into a device that was principally on premises only? Is based on your knowledge of automotive going to remote.
And what would you, just to help me out here, remote control in this context means at what granularity of control? Are you talking about remote control like in the loop, cloud delivered, controlled therapy? Or do you simply mean like software updates or maintenance?
There are already publicly available information on medical devices where cloud technology is in the loop, for instance, in radiation therapy treatment. But just using your imagination and with the spectrum more toward the kinetic side, what are things that might be unusual or maybe non-intuitive to think about for threat modeling when you start to introduce remote control on something kinetic or cyber physical? What could an automotive company could have done in their threat model to avoid some of those problems they had?
Well, so look, I think the chief thing to begin with, I mean, I think the challenge is it occurs at many levels, but at the lowest level, I think you need to work really hard to guarantee that you are speaking with the counterparty that you believe you're speaking to. A challenge is how that there can be vulnerabilities in multiple layers of this communication stack. And so in fact, in our vehicle, I'm aware of vulnerabilities that existed at the very lowest layer before you were even talking to a counterparty. that were just like in the code that implements cellular. And that is quite challenging because you bought that from a third party. And so you don't know that, in fact, someone can talk to it and take it over. But I think that, in general, one thing that helps quite a bit, particularly if you want, availability is very difficult to solve, but if you care about integrity, which I think is the really key issue in these kinetic kinds of contexts, is that you want to make sure that you have that every message that is going to drive you to do something actually comes with some demonstration, some hard to spoof cryptographic demonstration that in fact it originates from the intended party and that it originates from the intended party at that time. So that even if the underlying communication substrate is compromised, because no one should believe that you can't spoof a cellular signal or an Ethernet signal or anything like that, that you have some way of saying this is wrong. Now, a challenge that you have, though, that's different in this space is what do you do if you have a bad signal and you're in the middle of a critical scenario? And this applies both in in the automotive context. I always said, like, so what do you do if your malware detector says we have found a virus in the brake controller? Do you turn off the brakes? I mean, that's not a reasonable, like the kinds of things that we do on a PC don't really apply. Like this whole detection regime can be problematic when what we care about is immediate safety. So if like you're doing, telesurgery, this is a tricky issue. What do you do if you now are suspicious about the stream of input you're getting? You clearly don't want to use it, but to simply do nothing while the patient is open is also not going to be acceptable.
Right. So it sounds like the IT playbook isn't always going to work for the OT problem. What might make sense for IT would not.
Right. And so when I remember spending a bunch of time talking to the Google self-driving folks, and what they had been working on was basically a secondary failover system where if things looked like they were going awry, that it was smart enough, this was their theory, I remain skeptical, but that it was smart enough it could pull the car to the side of the road. And I said, okay, but what if it's in the middle of like 6 lanes of traffic? Is it smart enough to figure all that out? And people would roll their eyes at me. So I think that some of these are quite challenging situations. I think another problem is that this is not something that the sectors that develop these things this has not been a strength of theirs, is thinking through like, well, what happens if someone hijacks our DNS name and gets a new TLS certificate issued, which isn't that hard.
So we've just reached time, but I know I was going to get to one last question. So in negative 30 seconds, could you comment about, you mentioned third-party components in automobiles. Medical devices have third-party components as well. So I'm wondering if you can offer any high-level advice on just how to teach integration skills that OEMs can use as they're purchasing heterogeneous devices from different manufacturers into a product.
I'd say that the 2 bits of advice that I have are, so one is to actually spend some time familiarizing yourself with the device that you have purchased. The modern devices frequently have quite a few security features that, like, let's put it this way. Every time we've reverse engineered a medical device, no one has enabled their security features. I'm just shocked at how easy it is to get in when there are features already built into these SOCs and so forth that would make it quite difficult for us. But then the other is to don't assume, particularly when you are interacting with this other component, that the interactions that you have are only the ones that you imagine will happen in normal use. So you have to think of programming against this other component somewhat defensively. What if it returns an answer that is not an answer to a question that I asked? Like, that is my code prepared to handle that? So if someone can inject a question on my behalf or a request that I will not fall over when I get this unexpected response. And that's the other issue that I think we see a lot, is that in these embedded systems, people assume that because they're also tightly coupled, that they're the only ones who are going to be able to do something. And so that means that once you inject anything in the gears, you know, the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Well, thanks for that perspective. I think that will have to be our last discussion question for today. So thanks again for your time, Stefan. And again, this is the UCSF-Stanford CERSI FDA Distinguished Speaker Series on Cybersecurity for Biomedical Engineering. Today, we heard about automobile security and trying to learn what can we tease out from automobile security approaches for the medical product development world. Our next speaker will be Dr. Christian Bamath on April 21, and that will be about clinical perspectives on medical device security. So thank you for coming to the seminar, and this concludes our session for today.